soldiers who kept fighting after the war ended. The World War is what we are talking about here. I mean, some people are still fighting when the World War ended, like, I don't know, 70 years ago. Anyways.
Let's start with the unbelievable and work our way towards the ones that shouldn't even exist. Number 3, the soldier who kept fighting after it ended. When the war ended, there was one soldier who stayed behind, and no one knew why. The year is 1945. Germany and Japan had just surrendered, marking the end of World War II. Troops from around the world were returning home, reuniting with their families. But deep in the jungle of Morotai Island in Indonesia, a group of men from the Imperial Japanese Army never received the message. The last order they were
this is what I mean. How did they never receive the message but others did?
given was to fight it out, and with no way to communicate, they did just that. The island was occupied by the Allied forces who routinely did land sweeps, but every time they got close to the Japanese unit, the men began to unload their magazines. The Allied forces yelled at them to stop fighting since the war was over. But the Japanese unit thought it was a trick to get them to surrender, so they continued fighting. Months would go by, and with many gunfights, the unit began to lose men. Many were killed in combat, others were captured, starved, or died from disease, while some were consumed by fear and fled deeper into the jungle to never be seen again. Eventually, the months became years, and their numbers dwindled down to just 12 men. One day, the men came across leaflets that had been dropped from planes, stating that the war was over. But yet again, the men thought it was another trick and dismissed them as propaganda.
Doesn't that make them terrible though? Because then the war's ended but you're still fighting for no reason. So you're not fighting for anyone.
For years, the men continued to see warplanes in the sky, and with so many of them flying overhead, they knew they had made the right decision, as it was clear that the war was still ongoing. But little did the men know the Indonesian Air Force was nearby, and the pilots were simply practicing. After 12 years in the unbearable jungle, one of the men decided to leave the unit and flee further into the wilderness. Some say the men had tried to kill him, or he simply thought he was better off alone. This man's name was Teruo Nakamura, a man who by all accounts was already dead. As Nakamura ventured deeper into the jungle, he settled on a plot of land, built a small hut, and planted sweet potatoes. He spent his days fishing and cooking his catch in the dead of night, so as not to alert the enemy with the smoke of his fire.
But my question is, how do you have no connection for 12 years with your troops?
Spent his night staring up at the moon, wondering what his family back home was doing. He continued to live the same day over and over again. And even more years would pass him by. Little did he know, he was the only Japanese soldier left on the island. His fellow soldiers had died or left the island long ago. It is believed that a pilot flying over the island saw a small area that looked flat and seemed to be inhabited, so he reported the coordinates to the Indonesian authorities. A day just like the thousands of days before it, Nakamura was barely surviving when out of nowhere he heard something in the distance. But the years of exhaustion had caught up to him. He didn't bother to reach for his rifle and didn't even put up a fight. As the noises approached, he began to make out what sounded like a familiar melody from a previous life. And as he looked out into the jungle, a figure holding a white and red cloth emerged, and the melody they were singing was the Japanese national anthem. Nakamura was quickly taken to a hospital. There, he looked in the mirror, but the person who was staring back was not him. An older man, full of wrinkles and gray hair, a stranger. How many years had gone by? He was taken home to reunite with his family, but even that reality would become a nightmare. Both his parents had died many years ago. His wife, believing that he had died in the war, was now remarried, and his once infant son was now a grown man with 4 children of his own. It had been 30 long years, and the world had moved on without him. This picture was taken just moments after he had returned home and learned the heartbreaking news. Seeing the situation, his wife's new husband offered to move out of the home to let the couple reunite, but Nakamura refused the offer so as not to cause chaos to the family. He settled into an apartment nearby and was just happy he could visit them often. 4 years later, Nakamura would pass from lung cancer. Number 2.
Not gonna lie, if he only had 4 years of his life, I think it was better if he just lived in the forest or jungle, whatever it is. You just made it worse for him.
Soldier who disappeared into the jungle. Nakamura would pass from lung cancer. Number 2. The soldier who disappeared into the jungle. Deep in the jungle, 3 soldiers were still living in hiding, completely cut off from the world. One of them was Soichi Yokoi, a soldier stationed in the island of Guam during the war. One day, Allied planes began flying overhead, dropping thousands of bombs onto the island. The attack was relentless, killing many of his fellow soldiers and destroying their equipment and supplies. After the attack, American forces swarmed the island and a deadly battle broke out. Thousands of men were either killed in battle or captured, with only around 100 Japanese soldiers surviving the onslaught. Yokoi and 9 of his fellow soldiers just barely managed to escape with their lives and headed deeper into the dense and unforgivable jungle. For the next few days, the men moved around endlessly to evade capture, surviving off their rations of food. But eventually, their food ran out, and in a desperate attempt to survive, the group of men separated and broke off into smaller groups. Yokoi and 2 other men,
Wait, separating is a stupid decision.
Mikio Shichi and Satoshi Nakahata, were one of those groups and continued to travel further into the jungle. Once they were deep enough, the 3 men built underground caves for themselves, which they hid in during the day to avoid capture. The men survived by hunting and eating poisonous frogs, rats, bugs, snails, fruit, and anything they can get their hands on. This miserable existence went on for months, and then those months turned into years. One day, the men came across leaflets laying on the floor, stating that the war was over. The men all agreed it was propaganda meant to lure them out of hiding to be killed or captured.
I don't understand. Why not just die at this point? Why would you spend years when you're not even reporting to anyone at this point? So who are you saving?
So they remained in the jungle. The men alternated every few days to visit each other in their caves, passing the time telling stories, joking, and fantasizing about all the things they would do when they finally returned home. These stories went on for years, and soon, time itself became a blur. One year, a massive typhoon hit the island, destroying much of the vegetation and making finding food nearly impossible. For the next couple of years, the men were struggling to meet their nutritional needs and were barely surviving. The men were set to meet as they usually did every few days, so Yokoi crossed a small section of the jungle to visit his friends. Once he had arrived, Yokoi dropped down into his friend's cave, but what he found was nothing he could have prepared for. Inside that dark and isolated cave lay Shishi's lifeless body. Turned on its side, it was clear he had fallen asleep, but his body had finally had enough. Caught up in the horror, he ran through the jungle straight to Nakahata's cave to tell him. In a panic, he dropped down inside, but before he could speak, he saw it. Nakahata's body, also laying on its side. He had died as well.
Well, they was eating
The
poisonous
death of
stuff.
both his brothers hit Yokoi extremely hard, and he went days without eating or sleeping, later stating that he felt the warmth leave his heart that day. For the next few years, Yokoi lived alone, growing more paranoid as time went on, yet continuing to survive off the land, eating whatever he could find and only moving in the dead of night, carefully erasing his footsteps. One day, Yokoi got very sick in the jungle and was certain he would die from it, so he went in his cave to lay down and die. There, at least he knew the enemy would never find his corpse. But to his surprise, he woke up the following morning still breathing. The years in complete isolation continued, but eventually, Yokoi's luck
For how many
finally ran
years?
out. One day, he headed down to a nearby river and was shocked to encounter 2 enemy soldiers from the Allied forces. Knowing that he had been discovered, it would only be a matter of time before he would be captured and killed. So he decided to catch them off guard and kill them before they had their chance. But the men easily restrained him. They dragged him across a section of the jungle and into a dark building, and then did something he never expected. They handed him a bowl of hot soup. It turned out that the men were hunters, not soldiers. Yokoi was then turned into authorities and was set to return home. The news of Yokoi's capture exploded in Japan, and soon everyone wanted to hear his remarkable story. But before he would tell it, he first had to make a stop. He returned to his family's home to discover that they had died long ago while he was away. He traveled down to their family's gravestone, where he wept uncontrollably. There, he saw what was written on the stone, that he himself had been dead for nearly 30 years. Yokoi's story was broadcast on news stations and TV shows, and he toured Japan for months. People fell in love with him, and he became a popular TV personality.
Okay.
He got married, had children, and settled down. Yokoi lived a peaceful and quiet life until the day he passed, at the age of 82. Yokoi had spent 26 long years of his life in the jungle.
Oh, I'm not not gonna lie, that's a happy ending. At least he got back and get to live. Unlike the first guy who got like 4 years on his life. That's, by the way, less than COVID till now.
Number 1. The soldier who never believed it was over. Long after the war was over, one soldier was still hiding in the jungle, waiting for orders. The last thing his commander ever told him was, "It may be 3 years, it may be 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you."
This video is just telling me the minds that the people that join the army have is insane. I could never do this. At what point do you just go, you know what? Even if I get caught, I'm just gonna go out and just do my best in fighting. They just don't want to get caught and they want to just be there so that they can fight at any given point.
That soldier was Hiro Onoda, a young member of Japan's Army Special Intelligence Unit, sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines to conduct guerrilla warfare and gather intelligence. His orders were simple: lead a group of men behind enemy lines, destroy enemy planes and boats, and under no circumstances ever surrender. The island, which was once under Japanese control, had been taken by the Allied forces 2 years prior, and it was their job to prevent them from strengthening their position any further. His plan was simple: lead his men into battle when the enemy least expected it, and if defeat became inevitable, retreat into the jungle and switch to his specialty, guerrilla warfare. Then regroup, rinse, and repeat. But the moment he arrived on the island, things would not go as planned. Officers who outranked him gave different orders and instead instructed his men to fight the Allied forces head on. This style of attack would be a fatal mistake. The American soldiers quickly defeated them. Onoda saw that defeat was inevitable, but only managed to order 3 of his men to retreat into the jungle in time. The men worked their way deep into the jungle, pushing further in day after day. Their goal was to reach a Japanese camp that was over 9,000 feet in elevation at the top of a mountain. Once they arrived, the men were happy to find Japanese soldiers there, but their joy wouldn't last long. During the night, the camp was attacked by Filipino soldiers, and the entire camp and many soldiers were set ablaze. Onoda and his men once again fled deeper into the jungle. By this point, the men had gone through their entire rations of food and were scavenging the land for fruit and water just to survive. As they made their way through the jungle, the men came across the corpses of fellow soldiers, men who had fled the battle long before they arrived, only to perish in a foreign land, their remains swallowed and erased by vegetation. Months would go by and the men continued to move. But one day, while the men were searching for food, they came across 2 local villagers. So Onoda and his men quickly held them at gunpoint. The men, scared half to death, muttered the best they could, "The war is over." But seeing that they were not soldiers, they let them live. Onoda's men were thrilled with what the men had told them. But Onoda quickly ended the conversation and dismissed the claims entirely, believing that the men were so scared that they would have said anything not to be killed. So the men continued to work their way further across the island. They eventually settled on an area that was near water and a small farming village and built a shelter there. The men liked the area because they could steal the farmers' crops and kill their cattle for food. One day, the men crept near the village to shoot a cow, and as the gunshot rang out, another shot followed, killing one of Onoda's men with a headshot. The locals had set up an ambush as they were sick of their cattle being killed. In the battle, Onoda heavily injured a man, kidnapping him and dragging him back to their shelter. Suspecting that he was part of the Filipino army, the men stabbed him in the heart and killed him. Little did they know, the man was nothing more than a local farmer. After this killing, one of Onoda's men left the group as he had grown tired of fighting and disappeared into the jungle, leaving only Onoda and one other man named Kenshichi Kozuka. One day, the men heard what sounded like a loudspeaker coming from the jungle, so they carefully approached. As they got closer, they saw around a dozen men in the middle of the jungle holding up the Japanese flag. They yelled into the microphone stating that the war was over.
Why would you not go looking for your men though? Why are you looking for them after the people told you? So that's what I mean. It seems like a problem from the Japanese government. And I wonder how many of those was like never found.
But yet again, Onoda refused to believe them, even when the man holding the microphone was his own father.
What?
The men left behind radios, newspapers, and magazines to prove that the war was over and that the world had moved on. But nothing was good enough for Onoda.
I'm not gonna lie, I feel like this Onoda guy, yeah, he just became a pirate. He just didn't want to live the normal life anymore.
And he dismissed it all as propaganda. Years passed and the 2 men survived off the land, hunting wild game, foraging for food, and raiding nearby villages, killing anyone who got in their way. One year, during a typhoon, a woman who seemed disoriented stumbled near their shelter. Suspecting it was an enemy spy, the men quickly restrained her, killed her, and buried her body in a shallow grave. The woman was just a local villager who was believed to have gotten lost that night and ended up near the last two men she would ever want to encounter on that island. Even more years would pass them by, and before long, Kozuka had gray hair, and Onoda, a once young man, had many wrinkles. The two men passed their days in their shelter and raided villages at night for food. But
Yeah,
their
they
luck
was just
couldn't
living the
last
pirate life
forever.
at this point.
During one of their village raids, the men got into a battle with the Filipino police, and in that battle, Kozuka would be struck with a fatal gunshot wound, leaving Onoda as the only Japanese survivor on the entire island. For the next 2 years, Onoda lived in complete isolation and grew colder, as he continued to terrorize locals using guerrilla warfare tactics, hurting and killing many people to steal resources and survive. But one day, everything would change. A Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki heard of Onoda's story and traveled to the island to find him. He was determined to hear the story for himself, even if it cost him his life. He traveled for 4 days through the jungle where Onoda was known to be, and eventually ended up right in front of him, with a gun pointed right at his head. Onoda explained to him that he was simply following the instructions that his commander had given him at the start of the war, and he was determined to follow these orders until he was instructed otherwise. Suzuki told him that the war had ended years ago, but Onoda refused to surrender and returned back to his life in the jungle.
Yeah, he just liked the
But
pirate
Suzuki
life.
was stubborn and was determined to get what he came for, so he followed him, asking him question after question, wanting to know everything as he found Onoda's story incredibly interesting. Onoda eventually opened up and gave him what he wanted, as he had not spoken to anyone in over 2 years. The men shared a meal, a bottle of liquor, and even took this photograph together before Suzuki said his goodbye. Suzuki took that photograph to a man named Yoshimi Taniguchi, a bookseller. A few days later, that man arrived on the island to instruct Onoda to lay down his weapon. He told him it was a direct order from his commander. After all those years, he had kept his promise. A promise he had made nearly 30 years earlier.
What?
Once Onoda arrived in Japan and exited the plane...
Wait, so the bookshop owner was his commander? Did no one come up with the idea of just saying that, oh, your commander told me to tell you this? You fucking idiots!
Nearly 30 years earlier. Once Onoda arrived in Japan and exited the plane, he was shocked to receive a hero's welcome, with hundreds of people surrounding him. He was the last soldier to ever come home from the war. Onoda had spent nearly 30 years on the island. 28 and a half of those years were after the war had ended. But after the media and attention had died down, Onoda found himself on yet another unrecognizable island. But this time, it was one that he once called home. The way of life and the traditional Japanese values he had fought for no longer existed. Japan had become a consumer-driven society, something he could have never imagined. Onoda left Japan and moved to Brazil, where he became a cattle farmer, settled down, and got married. He lived to the age of 91 and passed in 2014. In the end, Onoda was called the hero by many, but to the villagers of Lubang, he was something else entirely.
Not gonna lie, I just have a feeling this brother just liked the pirate life. And also, what happened to the third guy that just left them earlier?